It is time to settle this debate once and for all. Do we still need to follow the laws and commands of the Old Testament?
Should we not put murderers and rapists to death like God says, even if it makes us uncomfortable?
I mean, when we read about God commanding the Israelites to take certain actions like killing the Canaanites or punishing certain sins with death, it can be pretty tough to understand how that applies to us today.
So when Christ comes back and rules with an iron rod for 1,000 years, he's not going to uphold the Levitical law he wrote?
So are we still supposed to be following those laws? Dr. Frank Turek is here to help us figure it out. Let's dive in and see what the Bible has to say about it.
Yes, hi, what's your name?
Nick.
Nick, go ahead, sir.
My question is in regards to the penalties associated with legislating morality. So keeping in mind that the story of the woman caught in adultery in John chapter 8 is not in any of the earliest manuscripts, and keeping in mind that it is a descriptive, not prescriptive passage. My question is, how can you say that we should legislate morality while simultaneously saying that you do not wish to impose the penalties for bad morality outlined in the Torah, the perfect law of God according to the New Testament? If God determined in the Torah to have the death penalty for blasphemy, murder, rape, kidnapping, bestiality, homosexuality, adultery, cursing or striking your mother or father, witchcraft, and many other sins, and then how can you oppose the death penalty for every single one of these actions? If you reject the death penalty, I'm not sure that you do, but if you do, as many modern Christians have, what man-made penalty are you proposing to institute for those crimes instead of death that would be equally efficient? Should we not put murderers and rapists to death like God says, even if it makes us uncomfortable?
Well, because the Old Testament isn't intended for anybody other than Israel.
So when Christ comes back and rules with an iron rod for 1,000 years, he's not going to uphold the Levitical law he wrote?
He fulfilled the Levitical law already. He is our sacrifice. I don't know what's going to happen in the future, but I do know that the Bible says in Psalm 147, verse 20, that God has only given that law to Israel. Also, the writer of Hebrews 8:13, says the old covenant is obsolete. It's obsolete. Those Old Testament laws were just for Israel. Some of them are repeated in the New Testament, and those that are repeated in the New Testament are binding on Christians, but they come with different penalties.
What are those penalties?
Well, for example, when it came to adultery, in the New Testament, it's not execution, it's excommunication from the church. So the New Testament has different penalties than the Old Testament. Remember, the Old Testament's a theocracy. And the New Testament for the world is not a theocracy. And so we need to keep that straight. This is why some people will say, well, you Christians get involved in politics are trying to establish a theocracy. We are not. I'm not. I would no more support a theocracy than I would support the radical left, because that's not the way we ought to govern people. Not in this era, because as the Bible itself says, that was just for ancient Israel, when God was literally their king.
As we heard earlier, this can be a complex topic with reasonable arguments on both sides. But I think the key is understanding the proper context. See, the laws God gave the Israelites were for a specific point in history, when they were wandering in the desert and settling the promised land. God was leading them as they formed their nation, so he gave them detailed rules for things like worship, food, sacrifices, and how to deal with sin in the community. Now the thing is, most of us today ain't Israelites from back then. We don't live under that same system of governance or culture. Plus, a lot of people forget that when Jesus came, he fulfilled the law and ushered in a new covenant through faith in him. So while there's still wisdom we can learn from the Old Testament, I don't think it means following every single rule to the letter. Things are different now under grace. The Bible even says the old covenant is obsolete. We got to read it understanding the time period and people it was written for. The laws were good for guiding Israel as a nation, but Christianity isn't about forming a theocracy. It's about having a relationship with God through Christ. So we got to be careful not to take things out of context. Make sense?
Can I have the verse that says that is just for ancient Israel?
What's that?
Can I have the verse that says that God's law in the Torah is only for ancient Israel?
Psalm 147 verse 20 is one place. You could go to 1 Corinthians 3 for more of this. You can go to Hebrews chapter 8 for more of this. Galatians, what do you have? 3. Galatians 3. In fact, that's the whole concept of the book of Galatians, right? The whole thing is about, will you guys stop trying to say everyone needs to be circumcised? Will you stop trying to say we have to obey the Old Testament law? In fact, the first church council, Acts 15, who's there? Peter, Paul, and James. And it says some believers from the party of the Pharisees wanted to know, do we have to obey all these Old Testament laws again? And you read what they say. They come up with this real short little letter. Just stay away from meat sacrificed to idols. Stay away from sexual immorality. If you do those things, you'll be fine. Farewell. That's it. Doesn't say you got to go through all the code in Leviticus. In fact, it would be impossible to obey the Old Testament today completely. Why? There's no temple. Where are you going to take your sacrifice? In fact, out of the 10 commandments, 9 of them are repeated in the New Testament. What's the only one not? Keep holy the Sabbath. Why? Jesus is our rest. Jesus is our Sabbath. We rest in him. He's fulfilled all the laws. We can't fulfill them anyway. I know it's going to sound weird, Nick, but it's true. Do you realize you can get to heaven by being good? You can. You just have to be perfect your whole life. Too late for me. How about you?
Too late.
Jesus was perfect. That's why we rest in him. Make sense? Okay.
The New Testament, and we see the apostles dealing with a whole new issue. Gentile Christians were coming into the faith, and the question was, do they have to follow all the Old Testament laws and commands too? Like, do they have to get circumcised? Well, the apostles had to address this issue head on, and what they said was really important. They made it clear that Gentile Christians didn't have to follow all the Old Testament laws and commands. Why? Because Jesus had come and fulfilled all those laws and commands on our behalf. So the apostles said that Gentile Christians only had to follow a few basic guidelines, like not eating food sacrificed to idols, not engaging in sexual immorality, and not consuming blood. That's it. They didn't have to get circumcised or follow all the other Old Testament laws. And that's still true for us today. As Christians, we're not under the Old Covenant anymore. We're under the New Covenant, established by Jesus. And that means we don't have to follow all the Old Testament laws and commands. Instead, we get to live in freedom, guided by the principles of love, grace, and mercy that Jesus taught us. Let's focus on living out our faith in Jesus and let his teachings guide us in our daily lives. That's the freedom and joy of being a Christian.